They say that some names only appear in the archives when something went very wrong. The surname Greyfen is one of those. It appears only a few times, on yellowed papers from the year 1888, always accompanied by silence, gaps, and hasty notes in the margins. For most people, it's just another forgotten case of men who went to work and never returned home. For those who delve deeper, however, it is one of the strangest episodes in the industrial history of rural Pennsylvania. Before continuing, anyone listening to this account is invited to make a small note in the comments. Write down which city you are watching from and what time it is there now. This is not mere curiosity. It is a way of marking, in the present time, the moment when this forgotten case is heard again. The remaining documents tell of two brothers, Elias Greyfen and Marlon Greyfen, blacksmiths, builders of metal structures, men of few words and strict routines. They lived in a small anonymous community squeezed between cold hills and newly installed railroad tracks. In the 1880s, that region was undergoing a period of transition. Old coal mines were already showing signs of exhaustion, while small mechanical workshops were springing up in converted barns and makeshift sheds. The Greyfens were not charismatic figures. There are no reports of laughter in taverns or grand speeches at public meetings. Instead, what we find are dry descriptions. Punctual men, reserved, skilled with iron and rivets. The letters ordering parts, recorded in the workshop's book, show a clear pattern. Reinforced grates, internal rails, support beams, metal pipes. These elements were gradually directed toward a single project, something that, in the records, appears only as underground test passage. Later, in oral testimonies, this name would be replaced by another, simpler and more disturbing, iron passage. The setting surrounding the brothers was one of hard work and low expectations. The wooden houses, lined up in irregular rows, breathed smoke from wood-burning stoves and steam from clothes drying on clotheslines. Children circulated between school and small shops. The local church, made of darkened wood, served both for Sunday masses and for improvised assemblies in times of conflict. Life there was made up of repetitions, harsh winters, dusty summers, and the constant sound of metal banging from the Greyfen workshop. Elias, the eldest, is described as a man with an upright posture, a deeply attentive gaze, and a curious habit. He would check the same measurement 3 times before authorizing any cut or weld. Marlon, the youngest, was described as the one who talked to the pieces, murmuring calculations, testing the weight of the metals with his hands, as if trying to identify by touch the limits of each structure. Together, the two formed a respected duo. If something needed to be built to last, they were the ones to turn to. The Iron Passage was officially born in 1884, according to one of the few contracts that have stood the test of time. In practice, however, the project seems to have gone far beyond what was stated on paper. The formal objective was simple: to build an underground metal corridor, partially embedded in an old mine drainage line, to test how iron plates would react to moisture, soil pressure, and temperature variations. The explanation made sense at a time when engineering was still advancing through trial and error. The accounts of the few workers who participated in the initial excavation phase describe an uncomfortable environment. Access was through a narrow opening, reinforced with iron plates and exposed rivets. The interior, still under construction, had walls covered with metal darkened by contact with the damp soil. An elongated corridor, without windows, with widely spaced points of light, oil lamps protected by iron structures. The feeling reported years later was always the same. It wasn't exactly fear, it was a discomfort that we couldn't explain. When the researcher who reconstructs this story today, decades, almost a century later, pores over the documents, he finds more absences than answers. And it is precisely in these absences that the case becomes more disturbing. There are no complete plans of the Iron Passage, only partial sketches, interrupted lines, measurements noted in the margins of sheets dealing with other subjects. On one of these sheets, Elias wrote in firm handwriting, Review internal reinforcements before authorizing group entry. The sentence is not dated, but the ink, already quite faded, appears to be from before 1888. The community surrounding the project did not fully understand what was being built there. For some, it was just another obsession of the Greyfen brothers. For others, it was a necessary step towards safer structures in future construction projects in the region. No one, however, seemed prepared for what would happen that particular year, the year when 36 men crossed the narrow access point of Iron Passage and disappeared into the metal corridor without a trace. Before that, the Greyfen's presence was still seen as a kind of guarantee of order. Elias discreetly attended some church meetings, always sitting in the back rows, listening more than talking. Marlon, on the other hand, was rarely seen outside the workshop, except when he needed to buy supplies. The two traveled little, avoided long trips, and seemed to have a pragmatic relationship with their work. Their world was limited to the noise of iron, the smell of oil, and the weight of the structures they lifted. That is precisely why a specific detail draws so much attention in the 1887 records. A tool shed, located next to the workshop, had been partially emptied. In its place, boxes of special screws, thicker plates, and reinforced internal structures began to arrive, as if something were being prepared to withstand much greater pressure than that of a simple test corridor. There is no direct explanation for this change in materials. There is, however, an isolated note attributed to Marlon. If the interior is not perfectly aligned, everything will just be a pretty shell on the outside. When looking at the sequence of documents, letters, and receipts, the story seems to move with the inevitability of train tracks. Slow, steady, and with no apparent deviations. First, the idea of an experimental metal corridor. Then, the gradual purchase of more resistant materials. Next, the consolidation of a 200-meter underground structure, with a single official entry point, next to an earth embankment, that became unstable during periods of heavy rain. Turning the last page of one of the logbooks, the researcher finds what appears to be the first concrete sign that something did, in fact, get out of control. At the end of a list of names, dates, and payments, there is a line with no value recorded. Just a brief comment in different handwriting, possibly from an employee of the local registry office. Check report on the 36 men of the Iron Passage. Shadows seen on the outer wall, no confirmation of return. When analyzing what preceded the disappearance of the 36 men, it becomes clear that the tragedy did not arise from a single sudden event, but from a slow accumulation of ignored signs, details that at the time seemed too trivial to warrant attention. Today, reconstructing the steps of those days with the distance of more than a century, these signs become almost impossible to ignore. The community's routine revolved around manual labor and predictability. Men woke up before sunrise, walked in silent rows to the mine or to their small workshops. Women took care of the houses, mended clothes, baked bread, and maintained the domestic rhythm without major variations. Children ran along the dirt road to the church school, which creaked with every gust of wind. Nothing there suggested that anything extraordinary was lurking. It was a place where each week resembled the previous one, and perhaps that is why no one immediately noticed the slight changes in the Greyfen's behavior. The first occurred in the spring of 1887. One of the region's steel suppliers reported that Marlon Greyfen, usually reserved, had begun to request thicker plates and longer pipes than necessary. When questioned, he replied only that they were internal reinforcements, without elaborating further. The supplier noted the purchase in the register, but added a comment that has survived the test of time. He asked twice to check the exact weight. He seemed nervous. The second sign involved Elias. He used to visit the church every Sunday, sitting in the back row, motionless like a piece of iron lifted by his own hands. However, in mid-September of that same year, he began to miss Mass. The pastor noted in his diary that he had asked some members of the community about the blacksmith, but they all responded with the same thing: he's working too hard. That too hard would become, months later, a constant in the testimonies. The Greyfen workshop, built next to the embankment that partially hid the entrance to Iron Passage, operated at unusual hours. Neighbors would later report hearing hammering after midnight, something extremely rare by the standards of the time. One of them, a farmer named Jonah Reeves, described years later a feeling that stayed with him for weeks. It seemed like they were racing against something, I don't know what, but there was a sense of urgency in the sound of the tools. Meanwhile, the Iron Passage was taking shape. Initially seen as an experimental corridor to test the strength of metals, it became a growing mystery. The community had no access to the interior, only to the workers directly hired for some stages of excavation and installation of the plates. And these workers, after the end of their shift, reported sensations that they could never clearly explain. One of them, Andrew Folsom, wrote in a letter to his brother, "In there, sound doesn't come back. The lamp goes out halfway, and when you speak, it seems like your own voice doesn't want to go on." It's hard to know if Andrew exaggerated or if his impression was true to the environment, but the letter exists. It's archived, and in it, one last sentence hangs like an involuntary footnote. "I don't know how long this will last." As the brothers delved deeper into the project, the community went about its business, but not without rumors. They said that Elias had turned down a lucrative contract to repair railroad equipment, something that would have been unthinkable months earlier. They also said that Marlon was seen carrying boxes of tools into the Iron Passage alone, without calling for helpers, and that both of them always seemed tired, almost exhausted, as if the project was draining something more than just physical strength. The Greyfen family had never been large. Their parents had died years earlier, leaving only the two brothers to take care of the workshop's legacy. Elias was known for his protective stance, Marlon for his curious gaze. Despite this, neither of them maintained close social relationships. They did not marry. They did not frequent taverns. They did not participate in community festivities, such as fall dances or spring fairs. The workshop was the total center of their lives. And apparently, Iron Passage had become more important than anything else. When talking to descendants of residents from that time, people who grew up hearing fragments of the story, there is always mention that there was something wrong in the air. It wasn't fear exactly, but a kind of restless expectation, typical of places where hard work coexists with an inexplicable sense of liminality. The idea that something was about to happen, although no one knew exactly what. In January 1888, the region was hit by a series of heavy rains that compromised small structures on the hillside. The entrance to Iron Passage was partially blocked by earth and debris. The internal lamps, which depended on a minimum air intake, began to fail. Neighbors report seeing Elias watching the slope for long minutes, motionless, with his arms crossed, and a more closed expression than usual. It was at this time that the third sign appeared. Perhaps the clearest of all. A young worker, hired temporarily to help remove some of the debris from the hillside, claimed to have seen outside the workshop a pile of technical drawings hastily burned. The partially destroyed sheets contained straight lines, internal structures, and numerical notes that he could not understand. One detail, however, stuck with him. The word stability was repeatedly written in bold letters, as if someone had scratched Elias's firm handwriting over Marlon's. Even so, no one imagined that these signs were foreshadowing a tragedy. The community trusted the Greyfens. They believed that if something was truly out of the ordinary, the brothers themselves would warn them. They had always been responsible, methodical, incapable of allowing others to take unnecessary risks. So when the partial landslide compromised the entrance to the passage, the decision to send a group of volunteer men to assess the damage seemed natural. It was a common task in the region, removing loose slabs, checking for possible leaks, reorganizing tools, the kind of work that dozens of men did every day in mines and workshops in the countryside. No one imagined that this would be the last time the group would be seen. On the morning that the 36 men gathered in front of the narrow entrance to Iron Passage, the air was especially humid, and the sky remained overcast as if the day had difficulty getting started. Records indicate that Elias was present, but he did not lead the team. He watched silently, with what many would later describe as a distant, heavy, unusual look. From the surviving archives, a single sentence attributed to him echoes like a belated warning. Don't take too long in there. The researcher who recounts all this today often wonders, did Elias know? Or did he just fear what he could no longer control? These questions become inevitable when looking at the subsequent testimonies, especially the best known of them, recorded 3 days after the disappearance. One of the residents stated that when the men entered, their shadows were cast on the outer wall of the hallway, long and irregular, shaped by the light of the lamps. He described how the shadows moved for a few minutes, and then stopped. The shadows remained. The men did not. And it is precisely when this detail appears in the records that the case takes a different turn, and the silence begins to become deafening. The morning of February 14, 1888, dawned slowly, heavily, covered by a fog that seemed to crawl up the hillside like a tired animal. The community was already awake when the 36 men gathered in front of the entrance to the iron passage. Some carried shovels, others reinforced lanterns. A few had tools attached to their belts, carefully adjusting the straps. Most of them had worked with the Greyfen before, and none imagined that this routine job would become the last record of their existence. Later testimonies described the scene with surprising clarity. The ground still damp from the previous night's rain, the acrid smell of turned earth, the distant echo of water dripping inside the structure. The compromised embankment had left the opening partially tilted to the right, forcing the men to enter at an angle, one at a time, as if crossing an invisible border that divided the familiar world outside the tunnel from the silent realm that awaited them inside. Elias Greyfen was there. Documents confirm that he walked through the area before the team entered, observing the condition of the passage and touching the iron plates with his fingertips, not like a blacksmith assessing his work, but like someone trying to sense something that could not be seen. One of the volunteers, Thomas Ridder, reported before disappearing that Elias was pale, more than usual, and that he muttered something like, "The lighting won't last long in there." Still, no formal warning was given. No order to retreat, only the phrase that would be repeated in later testimonies, "Don't stay in there too long." The kind of phrase that, said in another context, would have sounded like prudence, but on that day, it seemed more like a premonition. At 8:42 a.m., according to residents' estimates, the first man entered. His name was Reuben Mayer, a veteran miner known for his courage and habit of humming while he worked. He was the first to bend down and disappear into the metallic gloom of the corridor. Behind him came others: Lyle Henderson, Jonah Reeves, Nathan Cole, brothers, neighbors, men accustomed to the weight of iron and the darkness of mines. The initial sound of the group entering, heavy footsteps, the regular beating of tools, the clinking of lamps, echoed out of the iron passage. The narrow entrance amplified the noises, returning them with a slight delay, as if the tunnel itself were repeating every movement, every touch of iron against iron. To the observer, it seemed normal. During the first few minutes, everything went as expected. The men walked to the area where part of the metal ceiling had collapsed. They talked about how to reorganize the beams, assessed the warped plates, and discussed the infiltration on the right wall. Records indicate that up to this point, no abnormalities were noticed. But it is precisely in this interval that the researcher finds the first inconsistencies in the statements. Farmer Jonah Reeves, who had been standing outside watching the entrance, claimed to have seen the shadows of the men projected on the outer wall of the corridor. No one could explain how this was possible. The interior lighting should not have cast shadows outside. Nevertheless, more than one resident reported the same phenomenon. Long, distorted silhouettes moving from side to side, as if the tunnel had turned into a kind of inverted light box. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, something changed. The sounds diminished. First they stopped hearing the conversations, then the impacts of the tools. Finally, even the tinkling of the lamps seemed to dissolve inside the corridor, as if the air there absorbed every noise, swallowing it until only a thick, almost material silence remained. It was at that moment that a second phenomenon was reported. The shadows cast on the outer wall stopped. After a few seconds of immobility, they simply disappeared. They did not disappear to the right, to the left, or down. They disappeared as if someone had turned off the source that produced them, as if the light had been swallowed from within. The men outside did not immediately enter. No one at that time had a protocol for dealing with something like this. They called out their colleagues' names, twice, 3 times, no response. Reuben, Jonah, Lyle, Nathan, silence. At around 9:15, one of the volunteers outside, identified as Samuel Croft, entered as far as the natural light from the entrance would allow. He later described seeing the corridor intact, with no signs of further collapse, no fallen tools, no extinguished lamps. The floor was clean, as if no one had been there in the last few minutes. There were no voices. There were no boot marks. There was no smell of oil or smoke, just the uniform odor of cold metal plates. And then, the detail that most intrigued the authorities, a single lit lamp positioned on the floor, perfectly aligned with the center of the corridor, as if it had been placed there on purpose. No handprints holding it, no scratches on the metal. But the flame, it didn't flicker. It seemed motionless. When asked if he heard anything inside the iron passage, Samuel replied that he did, but he couldn't describe it. Something between a distant breath and a low, almost imperceptible vibration that made the air seem heavier than normal. A sound that did not form words, but was also not entirely natural. There was no explicit threat in that noise, just a feeling that something was not as it should be. The researcher, in reconstructing this part of the story, points out a curious detail. This is the only mention of any kind of sound coming from inside the tunnel after the disappearance. No other testimony records any subsequent noise. For all intents and purposes, after 9:20 a.m., the iron passage became completely silent. At 9:30 a.m., the community decided to send 4 men to enter a few meters into the corridor. They advanced to where the lit lamp was. The flame remained steady. There were no traces of human passage beyond that point. No objects belonging to the missing persons were found. No tools, no clothes, no food, no signs of movement. When one of them raised the lamp to illuminate the deeper interior, he reported that the light seemed to lose strength with each step he took forward, as if it were being absorbed by the darkness of the corridor. It was not ordinary darkness, but one that swallowed the light, in the words recorded. For safety's sake, they decided not to proceed, and as they retreated, one of them noticed something that was never explained. The lantern that had been left on the floor was out, but none of them had blown out the flame. None of them had come close enough to knock it over, and when they approached, the flame was still burning steadily. When this information reached Elias Greyfen's ears, he did not react immediately. He just closed his eyes and remained silent for a long few seconds. When he opened them again, he asked if anyone had touched the internal structure. They said no. He nodded, muttering something that few heard. "Then it is still as I left it." This phrase would become one of the most debated by historians. In the following hours, they tried multiple strategies, calling the missing by name, banging metal plates to create an echo, inserting ropes and pulling them back, lighting lanterns and walking a few meters, using trestles to support the entrance. Nothing worked. The iron passage returned everything with the same impenetrable silence. At the end of the afternoon, an official decision was made. No one else would enter that corridor without outside reinforcements. The community slowly dispersed, but Elias remained seated in front of the entrance until nightfall, staring at the opening as if searching for an answer that time would never give him. 3 weeks later, Elias Greyfen would also disappear, leaving behind only a notebook with torn pages and one last note. "If I'm right, then they never left. We just stopped seeing them." The researcher closes this part of the file and takes a deep breath. The region's greatest industrial tragedy occurred in a matter of hours, and yet it left no physical trace. What remains now is to understand how the community reacted and why the name Greyfen is still spoken in whispers. The hours that followed the disappearance of the 36 men left a deep mark on the history of that community. At first, no one believed they were really lost. The idea seemed too absurd to accept. Experienced men, accustomed to mines, tunnels, and daily risks, did not simply disappear inside a perfectly stable metal corridor. However, as the day progressed and no response came from inside the iron passage, something began to change in the residents' expressions. The conversations, once firm and practical, became hesitant whispers. The women who had accompanied their husbands in the morning began to lean on each other, hands clasped, as they stared at the dark entrance as if facing a place that once seemed merely functional, but now took on an almost insurmountable presence. The first rumors arose right there, even before sunset. They said that the embankment could have collapsed inside, blocking the men's return. Others claimed that a pocket of contaminated air could have weakened them. A few spoke of disorientation, believing that the corridor, being linear, could have caused confusion. But when the local authorities arrived, the sheriff, 2 deputies, and the pastor, all these explanations began to fall apart. The first clue came from the complete absence of physical signs. There were no scratch marks on the interior walls, no fallen tools, no structural damage beyond what was already known. The metal floor remained intact, with no sign of frenzy, confusion, or panic. If the men had gotten lost, where were their belongings? Their lanterns? Their coats? Nothing, absolutely nothing had changed inside the passageway. The second oddity came from the contradictory reports about the shadows. 3 residents claimed to have clearly seen the silhouettes of the group projecting out of the passageway, something that, according to the researchers' calculations, would be physically impossible, considering the internal position of the lanterns. Others swore that these shadows remained motionless, as if the men had stopped completely, and then they disappeared, without transition. When the sheriff heard this last part, he took a deep breath, adjusted his hat, and declared, with the objectivity that his position demanded, "Shadows don't disappear without a cause." But there was no visible cause. The news spread quickly. In less than 24 hours, families from nearby towns came to help with the search. Men accustomed to hard labor volunteered to enter the corridor. The sheriff refused, perhaps out of fear of losing more people, perhaps because of the expression he had seen on Elias Greyfen's face that morning. Elias remained on the sidelines of the search, watching everything in silence. He didn't argue, give orders, or protest. He just watched. Some residents interpreted this as guilt, others as shock. The researcher, however, when comparing testimonies from that time, notices something more complex. Elias seemed to be internally processing a hypothesis that he did not dare to share, like someone who recognizes too late that a miscalculation can have irreversible consequences. On the 3rd day of searching, they found Elias's notebook left on the workshop counter. It was an old notebook with a hard cover, containing technical notes, calculations, measurements of internal walls, and weight comparisons between different metal alloys. Some pages had been torn out, no one knows when. On the remaining pages, one note stood out for the urgency of the handwriting. The center needs to be reinforced. The internal pressure is not behaving as expected. This sentence, taken out of context, became the subject of countless theories. What kind of pressure was he referring to? Thermal, mechanical, structural? Why would the center of the tunnel need reinforcement if the original design was only experimental? And most importantly, why wasn't this concern shared before? Meanwhile, the community began to break down emotionally. Women cried outside the workshop, fearing their husbands would never return. Children stared at the tunnel, unable to understand why so many adults avoided approaching it. The pastor led daily prayers, asking for an answer. Any answer. On the 4th day, an outside team of engineers finally arrived. They walked the entire accessible length of the passageway, examining every rivet, every plate, every joint in the metal corridor. Nothing indicated collapse, leakage, or pressure change. Nothing suggested that the interior was unstable. It was as if the 36 men had never entered. And then, the detail that would change the course of the investigation emerged. One of the engineers found, stuck between 2 beams, a tiny piece of fabric, dark brown, sturdy, compatible with the work uniforms of the time. It was not torn. It was not burned. It was not stuck there by violent friction. It was folded, as if it had been placed there intentionally. The position of the fabric made no sense. It was too high for anyone to reach without a ladder. And it was right on the border between the area covered by the group and the deep section where no one had dared to enter. When they showed the fabric to Elias, he asked no questions. He just ran his thumb over the surface, took a deep breath and said, "It wasn't there before." It was the only categorical statement he made during the search. From that moment on, the collective narrative changed. From a plausible tragedy, it became an incomprehensible enigma. The authorities recorded the case as a disappearance under unknown circumstances. The community was divided between those who wanted to seal the tunnel and those who demanded further searches, but no new clues were found. 2 weeks later, Elias Greyfen disappeared without a trace. The door to his workshop was unlocked. The tools were organized. The notebook remained on the table, open to the same page. There was no sign of struggle, a hasty departure, or a farewell note. The only record was made by a neighbor who saw Elias standing in front of the iron passage the night before, staring intently into the dark interior, as if facing an abyss he knew by name. The researcher ends this section with a note written in the margin of his manuscripts. Perhaps what disappeared that day were not only men, but possible explanations. The consequences echoed for decades, but the most human revelation is yet to come, and it involves neither ghosts, legends, nor myths. It involves choices, guilt, and silences that have survived time itself. Decades later, when the name Greyfen no longer caused the same immediate murmur in family conversations, the case of the 36 men of Iron Passage still remained there, like a loose thread in the fabric of local history. Most of those who had witnessed those days were already buried. The original houses had been replaced, the church had been renovated twice, and the railroad tracks that cut through the region were no longer the same. Still, among the yellowed pages of forgotten archives, the story insisted on remaining open. This is where the researcher comes in, a man who was not part of the community, born long after the events, but who found himself drawn to an occurrence that almost no one mentioned anymore. The Greyfen case was not in widely publicized history books. It was not the subject of official lectures, nor did it appear on monuments. It survived only in side notes, scribbled in the margins of documents dealing with other matters. While searching for other research, the historian came across the surname by chance, like someone who stumbles upon a rock that should not be on that path. He started with little: a record in the registry office, a loose note in a pastor's diary, a reference in a technical report from 1889 that mentioned in passing the anomaly of the Iron Passage. And as he gathered each fragment, something bothered him deeply. It wasn't just the disappearance itself, it was the amount of silence that followed it. Tragic events usually generate an excess of words, inflammatory reports, attempts to explain the inexplicable. What he found here, however, was the opposite. Gaps, suppressed documents, torn pages, crossed-out passages. It was as if someone, or more than one person, had consciously decided to minimize the significance of that story, pushing it into a place where time could eventually erase it. Among the documents, the researcher found a letter that had never been sent. It was from one of the engineers who had participated in the attempts to inspect the Iron Passage, addressed to a superior in another city. The letter stopped in the middle of the 3rd page, unsigned, but contained a passage that, to the historian, sounded like the heart of it all. The structures are stable as far as we can go. The problem isn't the metal, it's what was done with it. The passage doesn't just look like a corridor, it looks like a boundary. And there is something in Elias Greyfen's eyes that indicates he understood that boundary better than any of us. From that point on, the researcher began to pursue not only the disappearance of the 36 men, but also that of Elias. The versions about him varied. Some said he fled, unable to cope with the guilt. Others believed he took his own life somewhere isolated. There were even those who whispered, more out of a need for myth than conviction, that he had returned to Iron Passage in the dead of night and never left. None of these versions, however, had any documentary support. What there were clues, small, fragmented, insistent. One of them was in a note in Elias's notebook, near the end of the pages, where the margins were more worn from handling. The handwriting there was not technical. It did not mention pressure, reinforcements, or measurements. It was a single sentence, almost an outburst. We didn't just build a corridor, we built a place we shouldn't have entered together. When the researcher read this sentence, he did not think of curses or invisible forces. He thought of something simpler and, for that very reason, more devastating: human limits. The possibility that the project had advanced beyond the actual control capacity of its creators. That the iron passage could have presented a sequence of structural reactions, minimal displacements, micro-deformations, gas pockets, air pressure zones, which combined produced a disorienting environment capable of compromising perception, balance, and sense of direction. If the men advanced as a group into the corridor, guided by lanterns in a line, a miscalculation could have transformed the center of the passage into a space where vision, sound, and orientation became deceptive. What from the outside appeared to be absolute silence could have been muffled screams, footsteps in circles, desperate attempts to find an exit that, to their senses, had disappeared. The absence of physical traces could be the result of a deeper internal collapse, closed in on itself at a point inaccessible without destroying the entire structure. Something that, at the time, would have required resources and technology that community did not possess. It was easier, cheaper, and more bearable for the collective mind to accept the disappearance as a kind of final point, even without a point. In this scenario, Elias ceases to be an alleged accomplice to something inexplicable and becomes something else. The man who realized too late that his calculation could have turned a test corridor into a trap with no return. His phrase, "Don't take too long in there," takes on a different meaning. No longer a simple cautionary warning, but the reflection of someone who knew, even without admitting it, that the interior of that structure was not behaving as it should. Guilt, in this case, would not require physical evidence. The weight of the hypothesis would suffice, the weight of imagining every night that a wrong number, insufficient reinforcement, a hasty decision to authorize group entry could have cost 36 lives. Elias's disappearance, thus, ceases to be pure mystery and becomes something painfully human. The silent withdrawal of someone who can no longer bear to inhabit the same space as the mistake he carries. The researcher, however, does not end his analysis with the Greyfen family. He returns to the community, to the families of those men, to the following generations. In interviews with descendants, he hears something that is not in the official documents. The informal, never recorded decision not to pass on details of the case to the children. The disappearance was mentioned in a few words, almost always in the same way. They went in to fix a passageway and didn't come back. Nothing about shadows. Nothing about lamps being lit and extinguished. Nothing about the folded fabric. Nothing about Elias's gaze. So it wasn't just the engineer who gave up on sending the letter. It was an entire community that, little by little, filed the matter away, not on shelves, but in silence. It's easier to go on living when the questions stop being asked. Sometimes what disappears isn't the people, it's the right to ask about them. At the end of his research, years after beginning this journey, the historian decided to write a more extensive report, bringing together everything he had found. Not to turn the case into legend, nor to prove any definitive theory, but to give back to the episode something that had been taken away: human complexity. He does not speak of curses, portals, or living shadows. He talks about risky structures, solitary decisions, economic pressures, technical pride, guilt, and the very human tendency to hide what we don't know how to fix. On the last page, he writes, "Whatever the exact technical explanation may be, which we may never fully discover, what remains is the trace of an irreversible mistake. Today, the Iron Passage is not just a closed corridor somewhere on the hillside. It is an internal place, which exists where we keep the things we prefer not to revisit. And then, Almost like a whisper, he adds one more line which does not appear in the official version of the report, but is recorded in his personal notebook. The 36 men and Elias did not disappear into an inexplicable void. They are still here, every time a structure is erected above the limit of our understanding, and every time someone decides not to ask any more questions. Finishing this note, the researcher closes his notebook, leans back in his chair, and lets silence fill the room. Outside, the world goes on. Cars, voices, artificial lights, screens. But for a few moments, everything seems suspended. Far away, among hills that almost no one visits anymore, the entrance to the old iron passage is no longer in use. Earth, roots, and rust have covered what was once exposed metal. Anyone passing by today would hardly be able to point out the exact place where so many men were last seen walking into the darkness. But for those who know the archives, a discreet feeling remains, that some stories do not end with a clear conclusion, but with an absence that we have learned to work around. The video ends here. The rest remains in the silence between you and your own shadow.